the forbidden bride of the Appalachians, Hannah and Thomas sealed their fate at the altar and paid with blood. Now, before we begin, I want to know where you are right now and what time it is there. Leave your answer in the comments. I find it incredible that the same story can reach so many different corners of the world at so many different times of day. Now let's get back to it, because what happened in the Appalachian Mountains in the winter of 1809 is something history has tried very hard to forget. A story of two people who dared to defy one of the most powerful men in their world, and paid a price that no one should ever have to pay just for choosing who to love. And we're not going to let that be forgotten. The Appalachian Mountains in the autumn of 1809 were not the kind of place that forgave weakness. The ridges rose sharp and indifferent against a pewter sky, blanketed in oak and hickory trees whose leaves had begun their slow surrender to the cold. The hollows between the hills trapped fog in the mornings thick and low, swallowing the cabins and dirt paths that wound through the valley like threads of an old fraying cloth. This was not a land of abundance. It was a land of endurance. The settlement of Greystone Hollow sat pressed against the eastern slope of one such ridge, a cluster of roughly 20 families who worked the same soil, breathed the same wood smoke, and answered to the same man. Their cabins were built from hand-hewn timber, their roofs patched with bark and salvaged shingles, their windows covered in winter with oiled cloth when glass was too expensive to replace. Gardens ran along the sides of each dwelling, rows of dying bean plants, wilted cabbage, the last of the season's squash rotting quietly on the vine. It was a place that smelled of damp earth, livestock, and the faint sweetness of wood fires burning before dawn. At the top of the hollow, where the road widened and the trees had been cleared back a full 100 yards, stood the Whitfield estate. It was not a mansion by the standards of the Virginia Tidewater or the Carolina lowlands, but by Greystone Hollow's measure it was a monument. 2 stories of dressed limestone, a covered porch running the full width of the front face, glass windows that caught the morning light and threw it back like cold fire. Colonel Harlan Whitfield had built it 20 years prior with money inherited from his father and labor extracted from the men and families who leased his land. He had never swung an axe to raise those walls. He had never needed to. Harlan Whitfield was 61 years old that autumn, a man built like a fence post, lean, rigid, and unyielding. His hair had gone entirely white, but his eyes remained the color of river slate, pale and flat and constantly calculating. He wore his authority the way other men wore coats, naturally without thinking, as though it had always been there. He did not shout at the men who worked his land. He did not need to. A look from Whitfield carried the weight of every lease agreement, every debt ledger, every winter when his tenants had needed his grain stores to survive. They owed him, and he never allowed them to forget it. Among those tenants was the Calloway family, who farmed a plot on the western edge of the hollow, where the soil was thinner and the tree line crept close enough to shade the garden by mid-afternoon. Robert Calloway was a quiet, weathered man of 50, his hands permanently stained with soil, his back bent slightly from decades of work that had asked more than his body could comfortably give. His wife, Margaret, was sharper, quick-eyed and practical, the kind of woman who could calculate a month's provisions in her head while stirring a pot and keeping an eye on the door. They had 2 children who had survived infancy. The eldest was a son named William, 19, and already apprenticed to a blacksmith 2 settlements over. The youngest was Hannah. Hannah Calloway was 22 years old, though in the context of Greystone Hollow, that age carried a weight that the number alone did not suggest. She was considered by the Hollow's informal accounting a woman who had waited long enough. She was not plain. Her features were strong and well-defined, her dark hair thick and usually pinned back with whatever was available, her hands already roughened from years of garden work and household labor. But it was her eyes that people remembered. They were a deep, steady brown, and they had the unsettling quality of looking at a person as though she were reading something written just behind their expression. She did not speak carelessly. When she had something to say, she said it once clearly and meant it entirely. She had grown up understanding the geometry of her world with a precision that no one had explicitly taught her. The Whitfield land was the boundary of everything possible. The lease her father held was the cord that tied the family to that boundary, and the terms of that lease, renewed each year at the Colonel's discretion, were the invisible ceiling above every decision the Calloways made. Hannah had watched her father lower his eyes in Whitfield's presence since she was old enough to notice. She had watched her mother count coins at the kitchen table with a focused silence that was its own kind of grief. She had understood from a young age that in Greystone Hollow survival was not a given. It was a negotiation. Thomas Reed had arrived in the Hollow 3 years prior. In the spring of 1806, carrying a tool chest, a single change of clothes, and a letter of introduction from a carpenter in Staunton who had vouched for his skill. He was 26 at the time, lean and deliberate in his movements, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes not from social standing but from knowing exactly what his hands were capable of. He had grown up in the Shenandoah Valley, the third son of a family with more children than prospects, and had apprenticed to a carpenter at 14. By the time he arrived in Greystone Hollow, he could frame a wall, hang a door, cut and fit a roof, and read a simple survey map. In a settlement where those skills were constantly needed and rarely well compensated, he made himself useful quickly. Whitfield had hired him first to repair the estate's barn, which had lost a section of its roof to a late winter storm. Thomas worked for 3 weeks on that job, efficient and unhurried, and when he finished, the Colonel had offered him informal standing in the Hollow, not a lease, not land, but the implicit permission to take work from the tenant families and to sleep in a small structure behind the mill that had been used for storage. It was not security, but it was a foothold, and Thomas Reed was a man who knew how to build from a foothold. He met Hannah Calloway in the way most things happened in Greystone Hollow, through necessity. Her father's cabin had a roof beam that had begun to sag, and Robert Calloway, whose back had worsened through the summer, could not manage the repair himself. Thomas came on a Tuesday morning in late September of 1807, assessed the damage without ceremony, and spent 2 days fixing it. Hannah brought him water and a midday meal both days, as was customary. They spoke very little the first day. On the second, she asked him a question about how he determined which wood to use for the replacement beam, and he gave her a longer answer than she had expected. Technical, precise, but spoken without condescension, as though he assumed she was capable of understanding it. She was. That was the beginning of it, not dramatic, not sudden. It grew the way things grow in cold climates, slowly, close to the ground, putting down roots before it showed anything above the surface. They found reasons to speak when their paths crossed, which, in a settlement of 20 families, happened regularly. They were careful, instinctively, without ever explicitly agreeing to be. Neither of them had the luxury of carelessness. By the winter of 1808, what existed between them had become undeniable, at least to themselves. Thomas had spoken to Hannah directly one evening near the mill, with the kind of plainness that suited both of them. He told her that he had intentions, that he understood the complications, and that he was not a man who spoke of such things lightly. Hannah had listened to him finish, then looked at him with those steady brown eyes and told him she knew. She had known for some time. The question, she said, was not what they felt. The question was what they were willing to do about it. What neither of them said aloud, but both of them understood, was the obstacle that stood between intention and action. It was not abstract. It had a name, a face, and a ledger full of debts. Colonel Harlan Whitfield had, over the preceding year, begun to make his own intentions known, not to Hannah, not directly, but to her father. He had extended the Calloway lease on unusually favorable terms. He had forgiven a portion of a debt incurred during a difficult harvest. He had mentioned, in the oblique way powerful men mention things they consider already decided, that he believed Hannah was a capable young woman who deserved a stable situation. The man he had in mind was his nephew, Gerard Whitfield, who managed a smaller property 12 miles north, and who was 38, twice widowed, and in need of a household. Robert Calloway had not said yes, but he had not said no, and in Whitfield's world, silence was a form of agreement. Hannah had learned of this arrangement not from her father, who had intended to find the right moment, but from her mother, who told her on a November evening with the directness of a woman who believed her daughter deserved the truth more than she deserved protection from it. Margaret Calloway had set down her mending, looked at her daughter across the firelight, and told her plainly what the colonel had proposed and what her father had not refused. Hannah had sat with that information for a long time without speaking. Then she had asked one question. Had the decision been made? Her mother had said no. Not yet. Hannah had nodded, stood up, and gone to bed. But she had not slept. She had lain in the dark and listened to the wind coming down off the ridge and thought about what it meant to have a life that other people arranged around you like furniture in a room you were never asked to design. And she had made a decision, not in anger, not in panic, but in the same quiet, deliberate way that she made every decision that mattered. She was not going to be furniture. 3 miles away in the small storage cabin behind the mill, Thomas Reed was awake as well. He had heard through the tight network of information that moves invisibly through small communities that Whitfield had spoken to Calloway. He lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about what he had and what he didn't have and what he was willing to risk. He was a carpenter with no land, no lease, and no standing beyond what the colonel's informal tolerance provided. To move against Whitfield's wishes was not simply romantic defiance. It was the potential end of everything he had built in 3 years. His work, his shelter, his place in the community. He thought about Hannah's eyes, the way she had said "I know" on that evening by the mill, calm and certain, as though she had already done the math and accepted the answer. He made his decision before the fire burned down to coals. The mountains kept their secrets well that autumn. The fog came in each morning and erased the hollow, and what moved beneath it, the glances, the brief exchanges, the slow, careful architecture of a plan, remained invisible to everyone who was not meant to see it. But Colonel Harlan Whitfield had not maintained his dominion over Greystone Hollow for 20 years by being inattentive. And winter was coming. December arrived in Greystone Hollow the way it always did, without apology. The first hard frost came on a Monday night, killing what remained of the late gardens and sealing the mud paths into rigid, uneven ridges that caught boots and turned ankles in the gray morning light. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the settlement dropped to a thin, dark current between frozen shelves of ice, and the sound of it, that constant, indifferent murmur, became muted and distant, as though the cold had silenced even the water. The tenant families pulled inward, doors stayed shut, fires burned through the night. The rhythm of the hollow contracted to the essentials: feed the animals, split the wood, preserve what food remained, endure. Social movement between households slowed to necessity. A borrowed tool, a shared concern about livestock, the occasional evening visit when loneliness outweighed the cold. In this contracted world where every movement was visible and every absence noted, Hannah and Thomas had learned to communicate in the narrow margins of ordinary life. A glance held a half-second longer than courtesy required. A few words exchanged near the well in the early morning, before the hollow fully woke. A folded note passed through Margaret Calloway, who had said nothing to her husband and would continue to say nothing, because she had made her own private calculation and arrived at her own quiet conclusion. She did not approve exactly, but she understood, and in the Appalachian winter of 1809, understanding was a form of loyalty. Thomas had been thinking carefully for weeks. He had no illusions about what he was planning. Defying Colonel Whitfield was not an act of rebellion that would pass unnoticed or be absorbed without consequence. Whitfield was not simply a landlord. He was the economic foundation of every family in the hollow. He controlled the grain store that had saved 3 families from starvation during the winter of 1804. He held the lease agreements that gave each tenant the right to farmland they could not afford to buy. He maintained the road that connected Greystone Hollow to the nearest market town, and he had made clear more than once that maintenance of that road was a courtesy he extended at his own discretion. To move against Whitfield openly was to risk not only Thomas's own position, but, potentially, the stability of the Calloway family's lease. That was the calculation that kept Thomas awake on the coldest nights, turning the problem over in his hands like a piece of warped timber, looking for a way to make it fit. He found his answer in Reverend Elias Boone. Boone was not a man of the hollow exactly. He was a circuit rider, a Methodist minister who traveled a route through 6 settlements along the western ridge. appearing in each community roughly once every 3 weeks to conduct services, perform baptisms and marriages, and administer whatever spiritual comfort the frontier required. He was 53 years old, compact and spare, with a face so deeply lined by weather and conviction that it looked carved rather than aged. He was not a man who adjusted his principles to accommodate the preferences of landowners. Thomas had observed this about him over 2 years of irregular attendance at his services and had filed it away as useful. He approached Boone on a Thursday evening in early December, at the home of the Whitaker family, where the Reverend customarily stayed during his visits. Thomas waited until the household had settled, then spoke to Boone privately near the fire, with the directness that the situation required. He explained the circumstances without embellishment, who Hannah was, who he was, what Whitfield intended, and what Thomas intended in response. He asked Boone if he would perform the marriage. Boone listened without interrupting. When Thomas finished, the Reverend was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with the expression of a man consulting something interior and non-negotiable. Then he asked one question: "Did the woman come of her own free will?" Thomas said yes. Boone said he would need to hear that from her directly. The meeting between Boone and Hannah took place 2 days later, in the Calloway cabin on a Saturday afternoon, while Robert Calloway was at the mill. Margaret was present, seated at her usual place by the window with her mending, which she did not put down but also did not look at. Boone asked Hannah the same question he had asked Thomas, and several others besides, whether she understood the consequences, whether she had considered her family's position, whether she was acting under any pressure or inducement beyond her own judgment. Hannah answered each question with the same measured directness she brought to every serious matter. She understood the consequences. She had considered her family. She was acting entirely under her own judgment. And then she said something that caused Boone to look at her with a different quality of attention. She said that she was not asking for his approval of her choice. She was asking for his ministry. There was a difference, and she trusted he knew it. Boone looked at her for a moment, then nodded once. He said he would be back through the hollow on the 4th Saturday of January. If they intended to proceed, they should be ready. What none of them knew, what could not have been known because the hollow's information networks ran in all directions and no one fully controlled them, was that Colonel Whitfield had a correspondent in the settlement, not a spy exactly, a man named Denton Hale, who farmed a plot adjacent to the Whitfield estate and whose lease renewal was perpetually uncertain, and who had learned over years that occasional information shared with the colonel had a way of translating into favorable terms. Hale was not malicious. He was simply frightened, and frightened men find all manner of justification for what they do. Hale had not heard the conversation between Thomas and Boone, but he had seen them together, had noted the length and privacy of the exchange, and had drawn the kind of inference that a man draws when he has been watching a situation develop for months. He said nothing immediately. He was not certain enough, but he kept watching. The January days were short and brutal. Snow came twice in the first 2 weeks, heavy and wet, collapsing a section of the Whitaker barn roof and blocking the main path out of the hollow for 3 days. Thomas worked through both storms, helping dig out paths, shoring up damaged structures, making himself useful in the way that had always been his most effective form of belonging. He worked alongside other men, shared their fires and their meals, spoke about weather and wood and the cost of iron, and said nothing about what was coming. Hannah moved through the same days with a surface of complete normalcy. She did her work, visited the neighbors she always visited, attended the Sunday gathering that served as the Hollow's informal church service in the absence of a permanent minister. She spoke to her father with the same quiet respect she always had, and if there was something withheld in her eyes when he talked about the spring and the lease and the future, Robert Calloway did not see it. He was a man who looked at the ground more than he looked at faces. It was in the 3rd week of January that Whitfield made his move. He summoned Robert Calloway to the estate on a Wednesday morning, not urgently, not threateningly, but in the manner of a man who considers such summons a natural extension of his authority. Robert came, as he always came, with his hat in his hands and his back already slightly bent before he crossed the threshold. Whitfield received him in the front room, offered him a seat and a measure of whiskey, and spoke with the ease of a man who has never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. He said that he had given the matter of Hannah considerable thought. He said that Gerard had expressed genuine interest, and that the arrangement would be by any reasonable measure advantageous for the Calloway family. The debt forgiven. The lease extended for 5 years at a fixed rate regardless of harvest. A small parcel of land, not much, a kitchen garden and a woodlot, transferred outright to Robert's name. It was, Whitfield said, a generous offer, and he said it in the tone of a man who was not accustomed to generosity being declined. Robert Calloway sat with the whiskey in his hand and the warmth of the fire on his face and felt the weight of every winter he had endured pressing down on his shoulders. 5 years of security, a piece of land in his own name. He thought of his wife's face at the kitchen table counting coins. He thought of what it would mean to be free of the annual renegotiation, the perpetual uncertainty, the lean years when a bad harvest meant a conversation with Whitfield that left him feeling smaller than when he had walked in. He did not say yes, but he said he would speak to his daughter. Whitfield smiled and refilled his glass. Robert walked home through the snow and told Margaret what had been offered. Margaret listened without expression, then said she needed to think. What she did instead was find a moment alone with Hannah that afternoon and tell her everything. The terms, the timeline, the 5-year lease, the piece of land. She told her with the same directness she had always used, because she believed her daughter deserved facts more than she deserved comfort. Hannah sat with it for a long time. Then she asked how much time they had. Margaret said Whitfield expected an answer by the end of the month. The 4th Saturday of January was 11 days away. Hannah found Thomas the next morning at the mill, arriving early enough that no one else was there yet. The snow still unmarked around the building and the cold so sharp it made the air feel brittle. She told him what had been offered and what the timeline was. Thomas listened without interrupting, his expression steady and unreadable in the way it became when he was thinking hard. When she finished, he asked if she had changed her mind. She looked at him with those brown eyes, calm and absolute. She said no. He nodded. He said then they needed to move the date. The problem was Boone. The Reverend was not due back in the hollow until the 4th Saturday, and reaching him before then required knowing his route and sending a rider, which meant involving another person, which meant another point of exposure. Thomas thought through the options with the methodical patience of a man accustomed to solving structural problems and arrived at the only workable answer. He would ride out himself, follow Boone's circuit to the next settlement along the ridge and ask him to come early. It would mean 2 days away from the hollow, 2 days in which his absence would be noticed and possibly questioned. He told Hannah he would leave the following morning. She walked back to the cabin through the snow, and if the cold bothered her, she did not show it. She had 11 days, possibly fewer. She had a minister willing to perform the ceremony, and a man willing to ride through a January ridge to reach him. She had her mother's careful silence and her own steady nerve. What she did not have was a guarantee of what came after. But she had stopped expecting guarantees some time ago. Greystone Hollow was not a place that offered them. That evening, Denton Hale watched Thomas Reed load his saddlebag by the light of the storage cabin's single lantern. He watched the horse move out of the hollow in the early dark, heading north along the ridge road. He thought about what he had seen. He thought about his lease renewal 3 months away. In the morning, he walked up to the Whitfield estate. Thomas Reed rode through a January ridge that had no interest in the urgency of human affairs. The road north, if it could be called a road, it was more accurately a suggestion made in dirt that winter had done its best to erase, wound through bare hardwood forest and across 2 creek crossings where the ice was thin enough to creak under the horse's weight. The sky sat low and white, the kind of sky that promised more snow before nightfall and delivered on the promise by mid-afternoon, a fine, dry fall that cut sideways in the wind and packed into the folds of Thomas's coat collar. He reached the settlement of Cedar Branch by late afternoon of the first day, cold through to the bone and tired in the particular way that combines physical exertion with sustained anxiety. Boone was there, as the circuit schedule suggested he would be, conducting an evening prayer service in the home of a family named Aldrich. Thomas waited outside in the cold until the service ended, stamping his feet and watching his breath rise and disappear in the darkening air. When Boone came out and found Thomas Reed standing in the yard with snow on his shoulders, the Reverend's expression shifted from surprise to something more carefully neutral. He did not ask what had happened. He looked at Thomas's face and understood that the situation had changed, and that the change had required a 2-day ride in January. They spoke inside, near the Aldrich fire, while the family made themselves scarce with the practiced discretion of people accustomed to the confidences that circuit riders carried. Thomas explained the development, Whitfield's offer, the timeline, the end of January deadline. He asked Boone if he could come to Greystone Hollow by the following weekend rather than the week after. Boone was quiet for a moment, running his thumb along the edge of his coat sleeve in a habitual gesture Thomas had noticed before. Then he said that moving his circuit created complications. There were families in 2 other settlements expecting him on specific days, and a circuit rider who became unreliable in his schedule lost something essential to his ministry. Thomas said he understood that. He said he was not asking Boone to abandon his route. He was asking him to compress it, to cover the next settlement 1 day earlier and arrive at Greystone Hollow by Saturday the 21st. Boone considered this with the deliberate care he brought to everything. He asked about the situation on the ground, whether Calloway's father had been informed, whether there was any possibility of the colonel intervening before a ceremony could be performed. Thomas said honestly that he did not know about the first, and that the second was a real possibility if they waited the full 11 days. Boone was quiet again. Outside, the snow was still falling, soft and indifferent against the shuttered window. Somewhere in the house, a child was being put to bed, and the muffled sound of it, a mother's voice, low and rhythmic, was the only warmth in the silence. Boone said he would make the adjustment. Thomas left Cedar Branch the following morning before first light, riding back south along the ridge with the revised plan fixed in his mind and the cold at his back. He reached Greystone Hollow by late afternoon of the second day, unsaddled the horse in the lean-to behind the mill, and walked through the deepening dusk to the Calloway cabin. He knocked twice, the pattern they had agreed on, and waited. Margaret opened the door. Her face told him immediately that something had shifted. She let him in, checked the path behind him, and closed the door. Hannah was at the table, and the way she sat, upright, hands flat on the wood, completely still, communicated a tension that her expression was working to contain. Robert Calloway was not present. He was, Margaret said, at the Hale cabin, which was where he had been spending his evenings with increasing frequency since the conversation with Whitfield. Thomas looked at Hannah. She looked back at him and said quietly that Denton Hale had been to see the colonel. She did not know this with certainty. No one had told her directly. But 2 days earlier, she had seen Hale coming down the estate road in the late morning, which was not a time or a route that had any ordinary explanation. She had said nothing to her father. She had waited for Thomas. Thomas absorbed this without visible reaction, then asked how confident she was. She said confident enough to act on it. He told her Boone would be in the hollow on Saturday the 21st. That was 4 days away. Hannah nodded slowly. Then she said that 4 days might be enough time for the colonel to move if Hale had told him what he suspected. They needed to understand what Whitfield knew and how quickly he intended to act on it. The answer came the following morning, and it was worse than uncertainty. Whitfield sent a message to Robert Calloway, delivered by his estate manager, a taciturn man named Graves who had worked for the colonel for 15 years, and who delivered his employer's communications with the flat efficiency of a man who had long since stopped having opinions about their content. The message was brief. Whitfield wished to conclude the arrangement regarding Hannah before the end of the week. He suggested Friday. He expected a formal agreement to be signed. Friday was 3 days away. Boone would not arrive until Saturday. Robert Calloway received this message and sat with it in the cabin for the better part of the morning, turning it over in the way that men turn over things they already know the answer to and are not ready to accept. When Hannah came in from the yard, he was still sitting at the table, the folded note in front of him, his hands on his knees. He told her about the message. He told her about the terms Whitfield had offered, the lease, the land, the debt. He told her, with the careful evasion of a man who knows he is asking for something he does not have the right to ask, that this arrangement would secure the family for years. That Gerard Whitfield was not a cruel man, from what he understood. That a woman in Hannah's position could do considerably worse. Hannah sat down across from him. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She looked at her father, at the bent back and the worn hands and the eyes that had been looking at the ground for so long they had almost forgotten how to look up, and she felt something complex and irreducible move through her, not contempt, not anger. Something closer to grief, and underneath it a love that was real and did not change what she had decided. She told him, quietly and directly, that she could not agree to the arrangement, that she had made a different choice, that she was asking him not to go to Whitfield on Friday. Robert looked at her. His expression was not angry. It was frightened, which was worse. He asked her what she meant by a different choice. She told him about Thomas. She told him everything, not quickly, not defensively, but with the same measured honesty her mother had always modeled. She told him how long it had been, what had been said, and what was planned. She told him that Reverend Boone had agreed to perform the ceremony and that it would happen on Saturday, if Robert did not prevent it. The silence that followed was the longest in the cabin's history. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, a horse moved in someone's paddock, hooves muffled in the snow. Robert Calloway sat in that silence with his hands on his knees and stared at his daughter's face, and what he saw there was something he recognized. The same quality of stillness that Margaret had, the kind that did not bend under pressure but that was not brittle either. It was the stillness of a decision already made at a level deeper than argument could reach. He asked, finally, what would happen to the family if he let this go forward? What would Whitfield do? Hannah said she did not know exactly, but she said that she would not be the reason her family lived in fear of a man's displeasure. She would not build a life on that foundation, and she would not ask her parents to. Robert said nothing more that evening. He went to bed early, and the cabin was very quiet. Margaret found Hannah by the fire an hour later and sat beside her without speaking for a long time. Then she said that her husband was a good man who had been worn down by years of a life that had asked too much of him. She said that he would not go to Whitfield on Friday. She said this with a certainty that she did not explain, and did not need to. Hannah leaned against her mother's shoulder just for a moment and allowed herself to feel the weight of what the next 4 days required. Saturday the 21st arrived under a sky that had finally cleared. The temperature had dropped overnight to something genuinely severe. The cold dense and absolute. The kind that made the air feel solid in the lungs. The hollow lay under a fresh cover of snow, and in the early morning light, blue and sharp and clean, it looked almost peaceful, the way places look before the day's business begins. Reverend Boone arrived at the Whitaker cabin just after dawn, his horse blowing hard from the cold, his face red above the collar of his coat. He said nothing about the arrangements to anyone at the Whitaker household, beyond the fact that he intended to conduct a brief ceremony that morning at the chapel, a single-room log structure at the center of the hollow that served as both meeting house and place of worship. He asked Mrs. Whitaker if she would be willing to stand as witness. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that suggested she understood more than he had said, and then said yes. The chapel was cold when they arrived. Thomas had come early to build a fire in the small iron stove in the corner, and by the time Hannah arrived with her mother, Robert Calloway walking behind them, his hat in his hands, his face unreadable. The room had taken on a thin warmth that was less about temperature than about presence. There were 5 people in the room: Hannah, Thomas, Margaret, Robert, and Mrs. Whitaker. Boone stood at the front with his Bible and the quiet authority of a man who had performed this ceremony dozens of times and understood, on each occasion, exactly what it meant. Hannah stood beside Thomas and felt the cold of the chapel floor through her boots and the warmth of the fire against her left side. She looked at Thomas's profile, the steadiness of it, the way he stood with his weight evenly distributed, completely present, and felt something settle in her chest that had been in motion for a very long time. Thomas looked at her, and in his expression was everything he was not prone to saying aloud: the recognition, the gravity, the absolute absence of doubt. Boone opened his Bible and began. The ceremony was brief and plain, as frontier ceremonies were. There were no flowers, no music, no formal dress. Hannah wore her best everyday clothes, a dark wool dress that had been her mother's, carefully mended. The vows were the traditional words, spoken in the order they had been spoken for generations, their weight coming not from novelty, but from the opposite, from the accumulated meaning of every time they had ever been said in full sincerity. When Thomas said, "I will," his voice was even and clear in the cold air. When Hannah said, "I will," there was a quality in it, not loud, not performative, but carrying the full register of a woman who had considered every word and chosen it deliberately, that caused Margaret Calloway to look down at her hands and breathe slowly through her nose. Robert Calloway stood at the back of the chapel and watched his daughter become a married woman, and the expression on his face was something that did not have a clean name. Grief and relief and love and fear, braided together in the particular way that a parent feels when a child steps beyond the reach of their protection and into a life of their own choosing. Boone pronounced them married, closed his Bible, and looked at them both with the steady regard of a man who understood exactly what he had just set in motion and had decided it was right. They stood in the chapel for a few minutes afterward, the small group of them, in a silence that was not uncomfortable but simply full. The way silence is full when something real has just happened and words are not yet the right instrument. Margaret embraced Hannah. Mrs. Whitaker offered her congratulations with genuine warmth. Robert shook Thomas's hand, once, firmly, and said nothing, which said everything. Outside, the hollow lay quiet in the cold morning light. The snow was undisturbed. The ridge stood against the sky, solid and indifferent as it had always stood. But somewhere up the road, behind the dressed limestone walls and the glass windows that caught the light like cold fire, Colonel Harlan Whitfield had just received a visitor. Denton Hale had not waited for Saturday to pass before going back to the estate. The news reached Whitfield before the chapel fire had fully died down. Denton Hale had left his cabin before the ceremony concluded, moving up the estate road with the quick hunched stride of a man who has convinced himself that what he is doing is not betrayal, but practicality. He had told himself, on the walk up, that he was simply reporting what he had observed, that Thomas Reed had returned from his 2-day ride, that Reverend Boone had arrived that morning, that the Calloway woman had walked to the chapel with her family before 8 o'clock. He had told himself that the colonel would have found out anyway, that these things always came out, that his lease was 3 months from renewal, and that he had a wife and 2 children and a root cellar that was already half empty in January. He told himself these things, and they were not entirely false, and they did not make him feel any better. Whitfield received him in the front room with the particular stillness of a man who is controlling a response that would otherwise not be controlled. He listened to Hale without interrupting, his hands flat on the arms of his chair, his slate-gray eyes fixed at a point somewhere past Hale's left shoulder. When Hale finished, the colonel asked 2 questions. He asked whether the ceremony had already been performed, and he asked whether Boone was still in the hollow. Hale said he believed the ceremony was happening at that moment, or had just concluded. He said he did not know Boone's plans. Whitfield thanked him. The tone in which he said it caused Hale to leave the room more quickly than dignity required. The colonel sat alone for approximately 5 minutes. Those who knew him well, and very few people knew him well, would have recognized this stillness as more dangerous than any display of temper. Harlan Whitfield did not lose his composure. He reorganized it. When he stood up and went to the door of his study to call for Graves, his voice was entirely level. He told Graves to have 2 horses saddled. He told him to find Silas Pryor, a man who worked the estate's outer fields and who was large, reliable, and did not ask questions about instructions, and have him ready to ride within the hour. He told Graves himself to prepare to accompany them. Then he put on his coat and his hat and stood at his front window and looked down at the hollow below, at the thin line of smoke rising from the chapel stovepipe, at the small figures emerging from the chapel door in the cold morning light, and he felt the particular fury of a man who has never had his arrangements unmade. He was not a man who acted in the heat of the moment. He was a man who acted with calculation and thoroughness. But calculation and thoroughness, applied in the service of wounded authority, can produce outcomes indistinguishable from rage. Down in the hollow, the small group outside the chapel had begun to disperse. Mrs. Whitaker walked back toward her cabin. Robert and Margaret Calloway stood with their daughter for a few minutes in the cold. And then Robert, who had been watching the estate road with the vigilance of a man who knows the landscape of his own anxiety, said they should go inside. There was no celebration planned. There had been no time to plan one, and in any case, celebration felt premature, not because of doubt but because of what all of them understood was likely coming. Thomas had spoken with Hannah that morning, before the ceremony, about what happened next. He had been direct about it. He had no illusions that Whitfield would accept what had happened without response. The question was the nature of the response and how quickly it would materialize. He had thought through the options with the same structural logic he brought to carpentry problems. What were the likely moves? What were the counter moves? What did the terrain require? What he had concluded was that the most important thing was not to be separated. Whitfield's leverage over any individual was greater than his leverage over two people standing together. A man alone could be threatened, coerced, driven off. Two people married in the presence of witnesses, with a minister who had performed the ceremony and a record that would exist in Boone's circuit register. That was a harder thing to unmake. He had also concluded that they needed allies in the hollow, and that the time for discretion about those allies was over. After the Calloways walked back toward their cabin, Thomas went to find the two men he had been thinking about. The first was Jonas Whitaker, Mrs. Whitaker's husband, a taciturn but fundamentally fair-minded man of 55 who had been in the hollow as long as Whitfield had, and who had, over the years, accumulated a low-burning resentment of the Colonel's methods that he never expressed directly, but that occasionally surfaced in the set of his jaw during Whitfield's more theatrical displays of authority. Thomas had not spoken to Jonas about any of this beforehand. He went to him now plainly, and told him what had happened and what he expected to happen before the day was out. Jonas Whitaker listened with his arms crossed and his eyes on the ground. Then he asked Thomas one question. Had the Calloway girl chosen this freely? Thomas said yes. Jonas uncrossed his arms. He said he would be around. The second man was Cyrus Holt, a tenant farmer whose plot sat at the southern entrance to the hollow, and who had a specific, personal grievance with Whitfield dating back 4 years, when the Colonel had arbitrarily reassigned a section of Holt's lease to an estate field without compensation or explanation. Holt had said nothing at the time. He had 3 young children and no alternatives, but he had not forgotten, and he was not the kind of man who forgot things quietly. Thomas found him mending fence line near his barn and had a similar conversation. Holt's response was shorter than Jonas Whitaker's. He simply nodded and said he would be there. Thomas walked back through the hollow toward the Calloway cabin, watching the estate road from the corner of his eye. The morning was still and bright, the snow throwing back the winter light in a way that made everything look sharper than it was. The hollow felt unusually quiet, which was either coincidence or the quality of attention a place takes on when something is about to happen. Hannah was in the cabin with her parents when he arrived. Robert had built up the fire and was sitting beside it with the blank, distant expression of a man trying to manage too many things at once. Margaret was at the table with bread and salt pork laid out, because food was what she offered when she did not know what else to offer. Hannah stood at the window watching the road. She heard the horses before she saw them. 3 riders came down the estate road at a pace that was not quite a gallop, but was faster than a visit warranted. Whitfield was in the center, straight-backed and deliberate in the saddle. Graves rode to his left. Pryor, who was broad-shouldered and blank-faced, rode to his right. They came through the snow without hurry, which was worse in its way than urgency. It communicated the absolute confidence of men who have never had to rush to get what they wanted. Thomas stepped outside as they rode up. He stood in front of the Calloway cabin door and did not move. Whitfield reined his horse and looked down at Thomas with the expression of a man regarding an obstacle he has already decided how to remove. He said nothing immediately. He looked at Thomas, then at the cabin door, then back at Thomas with the deliberate pace of a man who uses silence as an instrument. Then he said, in an entirely conversational tone, that Thomas should consider his situation carefully. He said that Thomas's presence in Greystone Hollow existed entirely at the Colonel's sufferance, that he had no lease, no property, no legal standing of any kind. He said that what had happened that morning in the chapel could be addressed through proper channels, that a marriage performed under irregular circumstances by a circuit rider could be contested, and that he had the means and the patience to pursue that course. He said, finally, that if Thomas chose to remove himself from the hollow before nightfall, quietly, without creating further difficulty, the matter of the Calloway lease would be treated as though the morning had not occurred. It was a precise offer, carefully constructed to isolate Thomas while leaving the Calloways nominally intact. It was the offer of a man who understood leverage and how to apply it without visible brutality. Thomas listened to all of it without changing his expression. Then he said, clearly enough to be heard by anyone within a reasonable distance, that he was Hannah Reed's husband, that the marriage had been performed by a licensed minister in the presence of witnesses, that it was recorded in Reverend Boone's official circuit register, and that he had no intention of leaving his home or his wife. The word home was deliberate. It staked a claim that had not existed that morning. Whitfield's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a recalibration, a reassessment of what kind of resistance he was dealing with. He looked at Graves and then, almost imperceptibly, at Pryor. It was at that moment that Jonas Whitaker came around the corner of the adjacent cabin, moving without apparent hurry, carrying a splitting axe in one hand in the manner of a man who simply happened to be transporting a tool. He stopped near Thomas and said nothing, looking up at the Colonel with the flat, weathered patience of a man who has spent his entire life in these mountains and is not impressed by horses or limestone houses. 20 seconds later, Cyrus Holt appeared from the opposite direction. He was not carrying anything. He did not need to. His presence, combined with Whitaker's, changed the arithmetic of the situation in a way that Pryor, whatever his instructions, visibly registered. The hollow had gone very quiet. From several of the surrounding cabins, people had appeared in doorways or at the edges of yards, not moving closer, not doing anything that could be characterized as a direct challenge, but present, watching. The community's invisible ledger of grievances against Whitfield, accumulated over years of lease negotiations, debt forgiveness that was never really forgiveness, and the 1,000 small humiliations of dependence, had in this moment found a focal point. Whitfield looked at the faces around him. He was not a stupid man. He could read a situation with accuracy, and what he read in this one was that the calculus had shifted. Pryor was one man, useful for individual intimidation, useless against a community that had decided, however temporarily and however silently, to hold a line together. He looked back at Thomas for a long moment, and what passed between them was the specific communication of two men who understand each other's positions entirely and are assessing what comes next. Then the Colonel said, in the same conversational tone he had used throughout, that the matter was not concluded. He said this looking at Thomas but also at the faces around the hollow, slowly, in a way that was meant to be remembered. He turned his horse and rode back up toward the estate, Graves and Pryor following. The hollow remained quiet for a long moment after they disappeared. Then Jonas Whitaker set his axe against the cabin wall and said it was cold to be standing around, and went inside. Cyrus Holt walked back toward his fence line without looking back. The figures in the doorways withdrew. Thomas stood in the snow outside the Calloway cabin and let out a breath that he had not been fully aware he was holding. Hannah opened the door behind him. She had watched the entire exchange from the window, and her face, when he turned to look at her, held the same steady composure it always held. But underneath it, in the slight tension around her eyes, was something that was not quite fear but was related to it, the acknowledgement of what had just almost happened and what had not. She said quietly that Whitfield had said the matter was not concluded. Thomas said he knew. She asked what they were going to do. He came inside and Margaret closed the door against the cold, and the four of them sat at the table and began to think through it, not in panic, not in celebration, but with the careful, grounded pragmatism of people who have lived their entire lives in a place that does not reward wishful thinking. Robert Calloway, who had not spoken since the riders arrived, looked up from the fire and said that Whitfield would go after the lease. That was the most direct and most devastating instrument available to him. Without the lease, the family lost the land, the cabin, the garden, everything that had taken 30 years to build. Thomas said he knew that too. He said he had been thinking about it since before the wedding. He said there were options. Not good ones, not easy ones, but real ones. A settlement 2 ridges north where a mill owner named Patterson had been looking for a skilled carpenter for 2 seasons. Land that could be leased outside Whitfield's territory at the cost of starting over. It would mean leaving. It would mean losing what the Calloways had here. He looked at Robert and Margaret when he said this, because he understood that the decision was not only his and Hannah's to make. He said he was sorry for what his presence had cost them, and what it might still cost. He said it plainly, without qualification, because he meant it. Margaret looked at him for a moment, then said that the cost of the alternative was one she was not willing to pay either. She said it quietly, without drama, and that was the end of that part of the conversation. Robert stared at the fire for a long time. Then he said that Patterson's mill was 30 miles north. He asked how soon Thomas thought they would need to move. Thomas said he did not know exactly, but he said he thought they should plan for spring and be ready to move in weeks. Outside, the afternoon light was already beginning to fail, the short January day pulling its color back over the ridge. The hollow lay quiet under its snow, the smoke rising straight from the chimneys in the still air, the shadows lengthening across the white ground. In the estate house at the top of the road, a lamp was lit in the study window, and behind it, Harlan Whitfield sat at his desk and opened the Calloway lease document and began to read it with the focused attention of a man looking for a door. The weeks that followed the wedding moved with a double quality. On the surface, the ordinary rhythm of a January hollow in the mountains, with its cold and its wood smoke and its compressed interior life. Underneath, a pressure that everyone in Greystone Hollow could feel, but that only some of them could name. Whitfield did not act immediately. This was, in retrospect, the most unsettling part of it. A man who acts in anger is readable, his moves shaped by emotion, and therefore somewhat predictable. Whitfield acted from patience, which was a different and more dangerous thing. He let a week pass. Then 2. The hollow watched the estate road and waited, and the waiting was its own kind of wearing down. Thomas and Hannah had moved into the storage cabin behind the mill, cramped, cold, inadequate by any reasonable standard, but theirs. Hannah brought what she could from the Calloway cabin: a quilt, 2 pots, a tin cup that had been her grandmother's. Thomas built a shelf along one wall and repaired the door latch that had never properly caught. They made it livable, with the focused practicality of people who understand that circumstances are temporary, and that the making of a home is an act of will, more than of resources. Thomas continued to take work in the hollow because stopping would have communicated a retreat he was not prepared to make. He fixed a broken plow shaft for the Holt family. He helped Jonas Whitaker replace the barn roof section that the December snow had damaged. He moved through the hollow with the same steady, unhurried presence he had always maintained, and if people watched him differently now, some with sympathy, some with the complicated discomfort of those who admire a risk they would not have taken themselves, he acknowledged it without making it a subject. Hannah spent those weeks in a manner that revealed the quality of her character more clearly than any crisis could have. She did not retreat into the cabin. She continued her own ordinary rounds, visits to her mother, work in what remained of the garden's winter maintenance, participation in the Sunday gathering that Boone had left in the charge of an elder until his next circuit visit. She was aware, constantly, of being watched and assessed, and she met that awareness with a composure that was not performance, but the natural expression of a woman who had decided something and was living inside that decision without apology. What she felt privately was more complex. In the evenings, in the small cabin with the fire and Thomas's quiet presence, she allowed herself to feel what the days required her to contain: the worry about her parents, the uncertainty about the future, the knowledge that the worst might still be coming, and that the mountain would not soften it when it arrived. She did not hide this from Thomas. She had never been a person who hid things from people she trusted, and she had decided to trust Thomas completely, which meant trusting him with the parts that were not composed. He listened to her in the evenings with the same quality of attention he brought to structural problems. Fully present, not rushing toward reassurance, letting the weight of it exist without trying immediately to fix it. It was, she thought, the thing she had recognized in him from the beginning, before she had words for it. He did not manage her feelings. He sat with them. In the second week of February, the door opened. Whitfield's instrument was not Graves, and it was not Pryor. It was a lawyer named Carver from the county seat, who arrived in Greystone Hollow on a gray Tuesday morning with a leather satchel and the careful neutrality of a man paid to deliver documents rather than opinions. He went first to the Whitfield estate, spent 2 hours inside, and then came down the road to the Calloway cabin, where he presented Robert Calloway with a formal notice of lease review. The document was precisely constructed. It cited a clause in the original lease agreement, one of several that Whitfield had always included in his standard contracts and that most of his tenants had signed without fully understanding, that allowed the landlord to initiate a review of the lease terms in the event of any material change in the circumstances of the tenant household. The marriage of a household member to a person of no fixed property or standing, the document argued, constituted such a change. The review would take place at the county courthouse in 60 days. Until it was resolved, the terms of the existing lease remained technically in force, but any renewal was suspended. Robert Calloway sat with the document for a long time after Carver left. Then he walked to the mill cabin and gave it to Thomas without speaking. Thomas read it twice. Then he asked Robert to sit down, and he told him what he was going to do. He had anticipated something like this, not this specific instrument, but the general category of legal pressure, which was the most sophisticated and durable form of coercion available to a man in Whitfield's position. He had spent the previous weeks thinking about it, and he had arrived at a conclusion that he had not yet shared with anyone, because he had not been certain enough to speak it until now. He was going to go to Staunton. The carpenter who had written his letter of introduction, Samuel Graves, no relation to the Colonel's estate manager, had connections to a lawyer there, a man named Alderton, who had a reputation for taking land cases against wealthy landowners, particularly cases where lease contracts had been used as instruments of control rather than fair agreement. Thomas had written to Graves 3 weeks earlier, explaining the situation in broad terms and asking whether Alderton would be willing to look at the case. He had received a reply 4 days ago, carried by a writer from the next settlement. Alderton would see him. Robert Calloway listened to this and asked how long Thomas would be gone. Thomas said 4 days, possibly 5. Robert nodded slowly. He did not ask whether this would work. He asked whether Hannah knew. Thomas said he was going to tell her tonight. Hannah's response when he told her that evening was to ask 2 questions. The first was practical. Could they afford Alderton's fee? Thomas said he had his savings from 3 years of work in the Hollow, and that Graves had indicated Alderton sometimes took cases on deferred payment when the circumstances warranted. The second question was more direct. Did Thomas believe this had a real chance? Or was he doing it because it was the only available action and doing something was better than doing nothing? Thomas looked at her and said he thought it had a real chance. He said the clause Whitfield had invoked was aggressive and probably contestable. He said Alderton would know better than either of them. He said that if Alderton told him the case was hopeless, he would come back and they would plan their move to Patterson's Mill with everything they had. Hannah looked at him for a long moment, and then she said to go. He left before dawn the next morning. The hollow was still dark, the stars hard and distant above the ridge, the cold settling into the kind of depth it reached only in the final weeks of winter before it began, imperceptibly, to release. He rode north out of the hollow and did not look back, not from any lack of feeling, but because looking back would not change anything, and he had a long ride ahead. The 4 days he was gone were the hardest of Hannah's life, since the morning she had learned about Whitfield's arrangement with her father. Not because anything dramatic happened. The hollow moved in its ordinary winter patterns, and no one from the estate came down the road, but because the uncertainty of it was the kind that has no action to absorb it. She could not work harder, or think more carefully, or make a better decision. She could only wait, and waiting had never suited her. She spent time with her mother, which helped. Margaret Calloway had a quality that Hannah had absorbed and built upon without entirely realizing it: the capacity to be fully present in difficult circumstances without being consumed by them. They worked together in the Calloway garden, turning the soil in preparation for the early planting that was still 6 weeks away, and talked about practical things, and sometimes did not talk at all, and both kinds of time were useful. Robert had grown quieter since the document arrived, folding further inward in the way that exhausted men fold. But Hannah noticed, on the third evening of Thomas's absence, that he had gotten out the lease document she had returned to him and was reading it himself. Slowly, with the focused effort of a man whose reading was labored but determined. She said nothing about it, but she saw it, and it meant something to her. Thomas returned on the 5th day, an hour before dark, riding into the hollow with the horse moving slowly under him and his face drawn from the road and the cold. Hannah was at the cabin door when he came up the path, and she read his face before he spoke because she had become, over the preceding weeks, a fluent reader of Thomas Reed's expressions. What she saw was not defeat. It was not uncomplicated hope either. It was the specific expression of a man who has received news that changes things, but does not resolve them. He came inside and sat down by the fire and told her. Alderton had reviewed the lease clause. His assessment was that the clause was enforceable as written, but potentially contestable on grounds of inequitable application. Specifically that Whitfield had never invoked it for any previous tenant household change, including marriages and deaths and inheritances, which suggested it was being applied selectively rather than consistently. A selective application could be argued, in a sympathetic court, as a misuse of contract terms. It was not a certain case. It was a viable one. The fee would be significant. Thomas had committed half his savings to retain Alderton for the initial filing. The rest would depend on the course of proceedings. There was a second thing, which Alderton had mentioned almost as an aside, but which Thomas had turned over carefully on the long ride home. The Patterson Mill, the one he had mentioned as an alternative 30 miles north, was in a county where land could currently be purchased, not leased, at prices that were steep but not entirely beyond the reach of a man with savings and a trade. Alderton had a client up that way who was selling a small parcel. It was not a solution to the immediate problem, but it was a different kind of future than the one they had been imagining. Hannah sat with all of this for a long time. The fire burned down a little. Outside, the last of the light left the sky and the hollow settled into its night quiet. Then she asked Thomas what he wanted to do. He said he wanted to fight the case and buy the land. He said he knew that was more than they could guarantee doing simultaneously. He said he was telling her what he wanted, not what he was certain they could manage, because she had asked for what he wanted, and he owed her an honest answer. She looked at him across the fire and felt something that was not simple but that was, underneath all its complexity, recognizable and solid. She said they should fight the case. She said that if they won, they would have the resources to think about the land. If they lost, they would go north and start from nothing, which was not the same as having nothing because of what they had already built together. She said this quietly, without drama, and meant every word of it. The spring came to Greystone Hollow the way it always came, gradually, then suddenly, the cold releasing its grip day by day until one morning the creek was running full and clear again, and the first green was showing in the south-facing banks. The hollow emerged from its winter contraction, doors opening, children appearing in yards, the quality of light changing from the flat white of January to something warmer and more particular. The legal proceedings moved on their own timeline, which bore no relationship to the seasons. Alderton filed the contestation in March. Whitfield's lawyer responded in April. There were hearings scheduled and postponed and rescheduled in the way of courts that had too much business and too little time. Thomas and Hannah lived inside this uncertainty with the patience of people who have no alternative to patience. What changed in those months was subtler than the outcome of the case. Robert Calloway, who had spent the winter folding inward, began in the spring to fold back out. He had read the lease document through 4 times by February, and in March he had ridden to the county seat himself, not to meet with lawyers, but to look at the public land records, something he had never done in 30 years of farming Whitfield's land. He came back quieter than he had left, and did not say much about what he had found, but Margaret told Hannah later that he had begun sleeping through the night again, which he had not done since December. Jonas Whittaker told Thomas in April, in the same flat, spare way he communicated everything, that 3 other tenant families had been talking, that they had their own histories with Whitfield's lease clauses, that if Alderton's case established a precedent, it would matter to more people than just the Reeds and the Calloways. He said this without commitment or promise, but Thomas understood what was being offered, which was the knowledge that they were not entirely alone. Denton Hale avoided Thomas for the first 2 months after the wedding. In April, he appeared at the mill cabin with a bucket of nails he owed Thomas from a transaction in December, and he set them down without meeting Thomas's eyes and started to leave. Thomas said his name and he stopped. Thomas said that he bore him no ill will. He said it simply, without the particular emphasis that would have made it a weapon. Hale looked at him for a moment, and what crossed his face was complicated and not fully legible, and then he nodded and walked away. It was not reconciliation, exactly, but it was something. The court ruled in July. The judge, a circuit court justice named Harmon, who was known for a strict reading of contract language and a limited patience for landlord overreach, found that the lease clause in question had been invoked selectively and inconsistently, and that its application in the present case did not meet the standard of material change as defined in the county's standard lease framework. The Calloway lease was restored to its previous terms. The review was dismissed. Thomas received the news by courier and walked to the Calloway cabin and told them. Robert sat at the table and put his hand flat on the wood and closed his eyes for a moment. Margaret, who never cried in front of people if she could help it, turned to the window and looked out at the garden for a while before she turned back. Hannah stood beside Thomas and felt the particular quality of a weight being lifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but with the specific physical sensation of something that had been pressing down, releasing its grip. She did not celebrate loudly. That was not her nature. She looked at Thomas and he looked at her, and what passed between them was the private acknowledgement of 2 people who had made a decision in the cold of a January chapel and had lived inside that decision through every consequence it produced. Whitfield was informed of the ruling by his lawyer, and received it in the same silence with which he received everything he did not wish to receive. He did not respond publicly. He did not come down the estate road. He turned back to his affairs because a man like Harlan Whitfield always had other affairs to turn back to, and the Hollow was only one of them. He was not finished, in the sense that a man of his nature is never entirely finished. But the shape of what was possible had changed, and both he and everyone in Greystone Hollow understood it. In the autumn of 1809, the same autumn that had begun with fog and frost and a silence full of things unsaid, Hannah and Thomas Reed began to save, seriously and systematically, for the land north of Patterson's Mill. It would take 3 more years. There would be a difficult winter in 1810, and a late frost in 1811 that damaged the Calloway garden badly enough to require another negotiation with Whitfield, which Robert handled himself for the first time, walking up the estate road with his hat on his head instead of in his hands. There would be a daughter born to Hannah and Thomas in 1812, delivered in the mill cabin on a February morning by Margaret Calloway, who held the child first and said her name, Clara, as though she had known it all along. The land north of Patterson's Mill was purchased in the spring of 1813, the deed signed in Thomas's name and Hannah's name both, which was not customary, but which the county clerk accepted without notable comment because Alderton had prepared the paperwork, and Alderton was thorough. They left Greystone Hollow on a morning in April when the ridges were green again, and the road north was passable, and Clara was 14 months old and interested in everything. Robert and Margaret came with them, not immediately, not permanently, but for the first season, to help settle the new place and then for another season, and eventually they stayed, because the alternative was remaining in the Hollow alone, and that, Margaret said, was not something she intended to do. The Appalachian Mountains did not notice any of this. The ridges stood as they had always stood, indifferent and enduring, the hollows between them filling with mist each morning and clearing by noon, the seasons moving in their ancient succession. The old chapel at the center of Greystone Hollow stood for another 40 years before it was torn down to make way for a proper church, and by then no one in the settlement remembered exactly who had been married in it on a cold January morning in 1809, or what it had cost, or what it had meant. But in the land records of the county north of Patterson's Mill, in the deed dated April 1813, the names were written in plain ink on official paper, in the permanent and indifferent way that records are made. Thomas Reed and Hannah Reed, his wife. A fact on file. A life documented. The mountains kept their secrets as they always had. But some things got written down.